Um, there will be a 1,000-word paper which the instructions are on the syllabus, and I'll have more to say about that during the semester. You pick your own topic. In some semesters I have assigned a topic and some I haven't. All right. History is a study of written records. Persons who saw an event will write down what they saw, and later people will come along, historians, and read what they wrote and make sense of it all. Now, the problem with written records, folk, is things can be somewhat confusing. One person will say one thing and one another, and you might notice when there's a mass shooting, you'll wind up everybody, you'll get a report that turns out later to be false, and another report will come in and it turns out to be false. This person will say one thing and that person will say another. Eventually we sort it all out. But nevertheless, you have your original sources, that's persons who saw and witnessed the event and wrote about it. Then your secondary sources, persons who lived after the event but read the original sources. But in the case of the American Indians, with one exception, we don't have written records. The exception are the Mayans. The Mayans wrote down, and they have written records that we still have. So that means that we have to turn to archaeology. And archaeology is a study of the artifacts these people left behind. Things like bones, baskets. By the way, the American Indian bones shows some things about the way they lived. The average lifespan was only 18 years. Rarely did one of them live to be 50. But then, like everybody else, they had a few people who lived to be in their 90s and even 100. It's been said every generation of humanity has produced a few people who live to be 100. Today we have a higher percentage of people reaching that. But anyway, historians focus on written records, but the period of time before the advent of written records is known as prehistory, prehistoric. Now, almost everything we know about America before 1492 comes from archaeology. This date, 1492, I don't emphasize dates much, but this is one I have to emphasize. That's the date, the year Columbus came across the Atlantic, and American, at least written American history, gets its start. But most everything we know before then comes from archaeology. We do not know when the first Indians arrived in America or where we came from. Now, the standard view is that they came across the Bering Strait. Now, you're going to have to use your imagination here a little bit. This is a public domain map of the world. No politics, no geography, just land and water. All right, the Bering Strait, all right, this map doesn't show it that well, but the Bering Strait is this narrow area here between Alaska and Siberia. And I believe that this is the closest point where that land, the land of the Americas meets the land of Eurasia, or Afro-Eurasia you might call it. And therefore that's how the American Indians came. They came across. And a lot of persons believe they possibly came across during an ice age. Why is an ice age so important? Is because during one of the ice ages, or more than one, a lot of ice froze along the north and south polar regions, so the water levels declined, and maybe the Indians and the animals, including buffalo, could, and especially the woolly mammoth, could walk on dry land. Woolly mammoths are found, or woolly mammoth carcasses are found in both Alaska, northern Canada, and in Siberia. So I believe that the woolly mammoth might have migrated during an ice age. Ice age, that brings up a whole new topic. The Earth throughout its history has warmed up several times and then it cools down. It'll warm up again and then it cools down. Warm up again and cool down. Has the Earth ever been hotter than it is now? as best as we can guess, yes, it has at least twice. There was a point in Earth's history when we had, during the Cretaceous period, folk, and you can look it up for yourself, I've done so, we had a uniform tropical climate. That means that even Antarctica, the north and south polar regions had a tropical climate, and you will find tropical fossils of tropical plants and animals growing in the north part of Greenland and growing in Antarctica, close to the South Pole even. At that time, the Earth was really, really hot, and life on Earth was never better, but it cooled down. The High Middle Ages, up until the years up until the early 1300s, were hot as a firecracker, but it cooled down. The last ice age is what we call the Little Ice Age, that lasted from the 1300s till the mid-1700s. And millions of people died as a result of the Little Ice Age. But anyway, a lot of persons believe that the American Indians came across the Bering Strait into Alaska during an ice age when that part of the ocean would have been frozen, or the water levels got so low that they could walk across on dry land. However, the Indians themselves always, when asked, how did you get to the Americas, they always say that they came by boat across the ocean, either across the Atlantic or across the Pacific. And we now know that you can cross both oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific, in a rowboat, 14-foot little rowboat, or even, I see one person nodding your head, you've heard that before, even in a kayak. Where do they get the water? If you know where to look, there are places in the ocean where the springs under the ocean spring up fresh water. You have to know where to look and recognize it when you see it, but you can find fresh water, even in the middle of the ocean. Fishing is very difficult in the middle of the ocean because the fish tend to not bite, but nevertheless it can be done, or you can carry along dried foods or salted food, and it'll last throughout your trip. Conspicuously, the Indians had no large domestic animals. They did not have the pig, did not have sheep, did not have goats, did not have cows, cattle, did not have horses, mules, any kind of equines. They didn't bring any of this stuff with them, so these things were totally lacking. Among farm plants, they did not have rye, wheat, barley, oats, any of the grains. So apparently when they came across, they came without any of this stuff. DNA evidence. DNA evidence shows that the American Indians tend to be of all types of humanity. The Mongoloid, the Negroid, the Caucasian, all types of humanity. Yes, we have evidence of African people living in Central America. The Olmec peoples appear to have been African. They have a lot of African features. Probably crossed the ocean at some point. Anyway, your book makes a comparison between Asians and Indians. So they both tend to have long, straight hair, black hair at that. They don't have a whole lot of body hair. They don't have a lot of facial hair. In other words, they don't grow thick beards. They tend to have brown skin. And language analysis shows characteristics, it shows Asiatic characteristics. In other words, the American Indian. Now, this last statement here is in your book, but a lot of people dispute it. Some people say that the American Indian languages simply have no relatives in Europe or Asia, and other people say that they do find it. Again, DNA evidence, that's not in my notes here, not in your book, but DNA evidence seems to show that the American Indians came from all over the globe, which means that the Americas were a melting pot of different peoples all down through time, not just since Columbus. All right. Who were the first Indians? The Paleo Indians. They used a spearhead known as a Clovis point which is a spear that would lock into an animal's hide and stay there. It was difficult. The animal could not easily pull it out, or could hardly pull it out. These are sometimes called the Clovis Indians. Now, they hunted a very, very large game. How large? During this time in history, and folks, you might have a hard time believing this, buffalo got to be as big as elephants. This is in your book. At the University of Georgia, there are some bones that I've heard some students call dinosaur bones. No, they're bones of a sloth. The sloth in those days in Georgia used to get as big as elephants. Those big animals all died out. The woolly mammoth, the mammoth is a type of elephant, except it has more hair than elephants do. The woolly mammoth, the American Indians hunted them. Somehow, though, all these big animals became extinct, and I can't believe that the Indians killed them all. It probably was a climate change that wiped them out. Well, what kind of climate change? A cooling down. If you haven't guessed, this present climate change hysteria, oh yeah, I mean, I don't doubt the climate's warming up, but wait and see. I think it's going to cool down. It might not do it within a few years, but I believe it's going to cool down based on the sunspot cycle. And being a ham radio operator, I can tell you, sunspots are very, very rare on the sun these days. You might say, I've heard that sunspots have no effect on the weather. That's true until you go 30, 40, and 50 years without a sunspot, which has happened once in history. We call it the Little Ice Age. All right. Now, the picture you get, folk, and this is another one of those times I'm going to disagree with the authors. The American Indians were primitive. They were hunters, food gatherers. They hunted with bows and arrows. Food gatherers are associated with primitive peoples. They go around foraging and finding whatever they can. They'll go to the woods and try to find mushrooms. And folk, if you do that, be really careful. There's two things. There's a mushroom and there's a toadstool. Make sure that what you pick up to eat is a mushroom. Toadstools will kill you. All right. Yeah, how to tell a mushroom from a toadstool by the late doctor. All right, enough of that. Anyway, but they look alike. But they would pick berries. They would even pick acorns and whatever, all kinds of stuff that they'd pick. And they'd hunt small game, big game, and they'd fish. This was a way this had subsistence living. This kind of living is often associated with primitive peoples. What is the main difference between primitive and civilized? Now, when I was a kid, my teacher asked me what makes a society civilized. I said, writing. No, writing is only a part of it. The main thing that makes society civilized is where you have a civil society where one person over here is a blacksmith, another person over here is a tanner, another person here is a farmer, another person is a government official, another person is a scholar, and each one of them have their own area of specialty, and then they trade with each other. The person who makes more leather goods than he needs will trade with the farmer for food, and in turn the leather worker will give some of his leather to the farmer in exchange for food, or the farmer will, the farmer will also trade with a blacksmith for metal products. Maybe the farmer needs a metal plow, so he'll get with a blacksmith and they'll trade their goods. That's civilization, folk, civil society. The American Indians are called uncivilized, at least the ones living north of the Rio Grande, because they didn't have this. What they had some stone tools. The stone was mostly flint stone, and a lot of people have made it their lifelong hobby to go around and looking at creek beds that are dried up, or looking around for Indian arrowheads, mostly made of flint, and sometimes you can find a high quality, well-preserved Indian arrowhead, or a tomahawk head. The tomahawk bigger than the arrowheads, of course, but the Indians would make tomahawks. They sometimes put the flint inside a tree limb and let the tree limb grow a few years to completely wrap up around the flint rock, then chop away at each end and then have a flint hatchet, flint tomahawk, where that the rock was solidly embedded inside the wood. And yeah, if you know anything about how trees grow, would know what I'm talking about. All right. And we talk about different kinds. There was the archaic, the Clovis Point hunters and gatherers gave way to the archaic peoples. Then among the tribes that we know about were the Great Plains Indians. Great Plains Indians were bison or other buffalo hunters. Bison is another way of saying buffalo. They used Folsom points or spearheads made of flint. They would sometimes get a large herd of buffalo and put the buffalo find the buffalo position near the edge of a cliff. Then the Indian warriors would all line up with their spears and arrows and whatever and start forcing the buffalo to go over the edge of the cliff. Then the Indians would come in and pick up their broken bodies and from the hide they'd make clothing and make teepees. And from the bones they'd sometimes make needles or even tools. And then of course they'd eat the meat. Anyway, or sometimes they would kill the buffaloes with their arrows, but it's difficult to bring a buffalo down with an arrow unless you have a pretty strong arrow. Great Basin. The Great Basin is an area in the Nevada, Utah, Arizona region where at one time it was an ocean above an ocean. And one day, maybe it was caused by an earthquake, the ground broke and the water in the Great Basin poured into the Pacific Ocean. We know of the place it poured in as the Grand Canyon. So the Grand Canyon was made when the Great Basin burst out and its water drained into the Pacific. I could say a lot more about that. This might not be what you've heard from other sources, by the way, about the Great Basin. But it was an area underwater. Now, we're talking right now about the Indians who lived north of the Rio Grande in what is today the United States and Canada. Were there any civilized Indians? Yes, 3 tribes. Well, actually, there were only 2 tribes of civilized Indians when Columbus came over. They were the Aztec and the Incas. What about the Maya? The Maya had greatly declined by the time Columbus came. Now, were there ever any civilizations north of the Rio Grande River, or in other words, in what is today the United States and Canada? The answer is yes. Your book opens up with a very large city. You know, civilized people tend to live in cities. A very large city located, I believe, somewhere in Missouri, where that a very wealthy chieftain, apparently king, was buried, and with him was buried bodies that were sacrificed. The American Indians tended to practice human sacrifice. Now, when they became tribal peoples later, I don't know that they still did that. But the ones that we found in North America when Columbus came, I've not heard that they ever practiced human sacrifice, but their ancestors did. Now, here's a point I want to make, folk. The American Indians living North America that the Europeans found after 1500 were actually descended from much more advanced Indians, and instead of advancing farther, they declined. The evidence shows it. What evidence? The fact that we have things called mounds. There were a lot of mounds, and mounds could not be made by tribal people, having only 200 or 300 people per tribe. Mounds were made by people living in large cities. Now, not far from here, in Cartersville, there's the New Echota Indian mounds, about 5 mounds, very big. Have any of you ever seen any of them? In my morning class, I had about 2 or 3 hands go up. None of you have, that's okay. I've seen them twice. In Ohio, there's a rattlesnake mound. He was not recognized. We flew over an airplane and realized this thing is a rattlesnake that has a head on one end and rattles on the other, that the length of it is 10 miles from head to tail. You cannot construct something like that unless you have two things. Number one, you have to have people who know advanced geometry. I mean, you can, any kid can make a sand rattlesnake, but I'm talking about one 10 miles long where you can't, when you stand ahead, you can't see the tail. When you stand ahead, you can't even see the third or fourth bend in it. When you stand the tail, you can't see the head. You either have to have advanced geometry or you have to have somebody directing the operation from up high who has some way to communicate with the people on the ground. Now hold on to your seats. In South America, there's the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines are miles and miles of lines, some of them super straight. You cannot make a straight line, folk, go over the horizon and still stay straight over horizon after horizon, unless you have someone who knows a lot of advanced geometry, or unless the operation is directed from above. Now, we do know that the South Americans had the balloon, but they only used it to take dead bodies, put dead bodies in the casket of the balloon, and then the balloon would flow out over the Pacific Ocean and at some point drop down, and that was the way they disposed of the dead. We do not know if any live person ever rode in one of the balloons, but they did have the balloon. Some of these Nazca lines don't just depict straight lines, they depict owls, animals of various kinds, cat-like animals. From the ground, you can't tell it. In fact, you're standing on the ground, and let's say you're on just off the line, and right here's the line. You could just tell the ground is just barely discolored. You don't notice anything, really, until you get high up and look down, like in an airplane. Then you can see that, hey, what this looks like a slight discoloration on the ground is actually a picture of an animal from the air. How to do it? Can anyone explain to me how the Egyptians could construct the Great Pyramid using stones that weigh 60 tons, that were quarried 600 miles away, deep inside of Africa, and then carried from deep inside of Africa to Egypt without leaving a trail? If you don't have an explanation, I don't either. The pyramid is a fascinating shape, or was it for the ancients? Yes, the Indians built them too. The biggest pyramid is not the pyramid at Giza in Egypt, the pyramid of Cheops, or you might say they call them the pyramid of Khufu, the Great Pyramid. The biggest pyramid in the world is actually at the Yucatan Peninsula, built by the Mayans. The pyramid of Yucatan is made of dirt. Well, you might say, well, it's easy to understand. They just simply kept piling dirt till, it would have taken thousands of years, unless it had more than little buckets to pile it up in. These people had stone moving techniques. At Cuzco is 13,000 feet. Well, what's so great about that? Simply because Cuzco is on the seacoast, the cliff rises from the ocean almost straight up 13,000 feet. At the top is a bunch of rocks weighing tons that are put together in a building. No two are the same shape, and yet they all fit together like the pieces of an interlocking puzzle. How did they get those rocks from the floor, but down at the bottom, up 13? These rocks were not mined 13,000 feet. And I want to remind you that the human body cannot go from sea level to 13,000 feet all at once. You have to take days to get used to the rarefied air. What am I saying for all this? Ancient man was not primitive. Ancient man was advanced, and possibly even more so than we are. I'm not the only person who thinks that, folk. The North American Indians, yes, I think at one time they were highly advanced. By the time the Europeans found them, they were primitive tribal peoples. What went wrong? While you're thinking about that, I'll pause and take roll before I forget. I don't like for roll to be online.